I had paid $12,384.50 for a Christmas dinner that began without me. The receipt still burned in my pocket, like a cold truth written in ink. How could joy cost so much and yet leave me standing outside in the snow? Before we move forward, please subscribe to the channel and share in the comments what time it is where you are right now. The doorman's voice was polished, trained to soften blows. Sorry, sir. Your name is not on the guest list. I studied his hands, white gloves clutching a leather binder, like some gatekeeper of belonging. Behind him, through a wall of glass, I saw my family. Laughter rippled over the clinking of crystal. A silver tray passed, reflecting the golden chandeliers. And there they were, my children, my grandchildren, celebrating without me. It struck me then that I was not witnessing a mistake, but the opening scene of a family drama that had been years in the making. Every smile inside seemed rehearsed, every glance choreographed to exclude me. Is this a mistake? I asked the doorman, my voice sharper than I intended. He lowered his eyes. I only know what I've been told, sir. Told by whom? A son? A daughter? The very blood that carried my name? The word hung heavy, deceit, subtle, deliberate, cruel. I stepped back, the city cold wrapping around me. The receipt in my pocket pressed against my leg, its numbers heavy as a verdict. Was I nothing more than a wallet to them? The elevator carried me to the 34th floor in silence, its brass walls reflecting a tired man I barely recognized. When the doors slid open, my penthouse greeted me with its usual perfection. Marble floors polished like mirrors, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, where snow draped the trees like lace. Everything gleamed, but none of it was warm. I set my coat across the leather armchair, the one I bought in Milan 20 years ago, and the sound of the fabric sliding against it was the only reply I got. A lifetime of comfort, yet the air inside felt colder than the December wind outside. Wealth can purchase silence, I thought, but it cannot buy belonging. Linda's face surfaced in my memory, her measured smile, the way she kept her distance even in a crowd. Michael, my eldest, now the man of the family in their eyes, perhaps the architect of tonight's exile. His wife Samantha, always whispering just low enough for me to wonder. Rachel, my youngest, still with eyes that once looked at me without judgment. And Noah, sweet Noah, who at 10 years old doesn't yet understand how the bonds of blood can be severed not by scissors, but by choice. I whispered into the empty room. I built this family, brick by brick. So why am I outside the glass? My phone lit up on the counter, vibrating against granite. Rachel's name. For a moment I hesitated, afraid of what silence might follow if I answered. Finally, I pressed accept. Her voice trembled. Dad, I didn't know you weren't invited. The words cracked something deep inside me. An admission, half-truth, or perhaps just another shadow in the long corridor of deceit that now defined my household. Did she really not know, or was this the gentlest way to betray me? Rachel, I said softly. Who decided I should be left out? On the other end, silence stretched. I could hear her breathing, uneven, as though each inhale was a choice. Dad, she whispered, it's not that simple. But it was. They had gathered. They had laughed. They had raised their glasses. And I had been erased. The city lights glittered beyond my window, mocking me with their constancy. Families below walked arm in arm through Central Park, scarves tucked, twinkle, mittens joined. Mine, however, was breaking apart like glass dropped on marble. And I wondered, was I now a guest in my own bloodline, destined to watch the unfolding of this family drama from behind the glass forever? The receipt was still folded in my coat pocket, edges crinkled from the grip of my hand. $12,384.50. I slid it out and studied it beneath the glow of my kitchen lights. The numbers stared back like an accusation. Each digit a reminder that I had financed the very night that cast me out. My mind drifted to Michael's words from just weeks before. We had been sitting in my study, shelves lined with books I'd collected over 40 years. He leaned against the desk, confidence in his voice. "Dad, this dinner will honor you. It'll be our way of showing what you mean to the family. Honor me." That phrase now rang hollow, like an echo in an abandoned cathedral. I closed my eyes and saw them again. My family raising glasses, laughing without hesitation, the kind of laughter that requires forgetting who isn't there. And me, outside the glass, holding proof of my own exclusion. A knock interrupted my thoughts. When I opened the door, it was Isabella, one of the servers from the Fifth Avenue restaurant. She looked barely 20, her apron still wrinkled, eyes wide with the kind of nervous honesty that slips past rehearsed manners. "Mr. Reed," she said softly, glancing down the hall before speaking again. "I think this belongs to you. I wasn't supposed to hand it out, but it got mixed up with your bill." She extended a folded slip of paper. The ink was smudged from kitchen steam, but the words were legible, each letter a blade. "Remove Dad from guest list." For a moment I couldn't breathe. The hallway swayed, the chandeliers above me blurring into fractured halos. I heard Isabella whisper again. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean for you to see this." But I had. And there it was. The truth I could no longer ignore. I stared at the paper, my voice low, almost to myself. So it wasn't a mistake. It was planned. The young woman's silence confirmed what the words had already screamed. This was no accident, no oversight. It was deliberate. And as I stood there, receipt in one hand, order slip in the other, I wondered, was this the first move in a quiet campaign to erase me completely? The slip of paper lay on my desk, its 4 words burning deeper with every glance. "Remove Dad from guest list." I kept reading it, as if repetition would change the truth, soften its edge, but the edge only cut sharper. My son's handwriting was scrawled in the margin, a small note of confirmation that left no room for doubt. Michael. I stared at the phone for hours before I finally called him. My thumb hovered over his name, memories colliding with the present. His first steps across our living room floor, his college graduation where I sat in the front row, his wedding toast when he raised a glass and said, "Everything I am is because of my father." Was that a lie too? Or had time chipped away at his sincerity until nothing remained but convenience? The line clicked open. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "Did you erase me, Michael?" My voice was lower than I expected, brittle but steady. A long silence, then his reply, measured, almost rehearsed. "Dad, you wouldn't understand. It's better this way. Better this way." The words rattled through me like broken glass in a tin can. My son had chosen exile for me, and he dressed it in justification. Through the receiver, faint but unmistakable, came Linda's voice. "Just keep him away tonight." My chest tightened. There it was. The orchestration behind the curtain. My ex-wife, pulling strings even now, years after the divorce papers had been signed in a courthouse on Center Street. I remembered the settlement check, the number etched in my memory. 1.2 million to close that chapter, or so I thought. Was this her way of finishing what the law had not? Quietly erasing me from the family I had built, brick by brick, dollar by dollar? The thought lodged itself like a thorn under my ribs. The phone line buzzed in the silence that followed. Michael didn't speak again, and neither did I. Perhaps he couldn't bear to admit the truth. Or perhaps deceit had already cemented itself so firmly between us that there was nothing left to salvage. When I hung up, the apartment seemed larger than ever. The leather armchairs, the glass coffee table, the Persian rug I bought in 1985 on a business trip to Istanbul. All relics of a life I once thought secure. Now they felt like props in a stage play where I no longer had a role. I walked to the window. Central Park stretched out beneath the night sky, the lamps flickering like distant beacons. Families strolled below, their laughter drifting upward, faint but intact. I pressed my palm against the cold glass, and asked myself the question that clawed at the edges of my mind. If a father becomes invisible to his own blood, does he still exist? If this story touched something deep inside you, please like and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive. Bryant Park was nearly empty, save for the glow of string lights wrapped around bare winter trees and the hiss of skates carving across the rink nearby. I sat on a bench, collar turned up against the biting wind, watching strangers glide in circles while my own family spun me out of theirs. A gust rattled the pages of the free newspaper abandoned beside me, its headline screaming about Wall Street bonuses. 12 million here, 40 million there. I almost laughed. I couldn't even buy a seat at my own family's table with 12,000. I muttered to myself, all my life I fought for them, and tonight I'm a stranger. The words hung in the air, visible in my breath, then vanished like smoke. A couple walked past, mid-argument about who forgot to pay the Con Ed bill. Their quarrel felt oddly enviable. At least they were arguing because they belonged to each other. I had silence. And worse than silence, I had deliberate absence, chosen exclusion. That was heavier than loneliness. It was rejection dressed in evening clothes. My phone buzzed. For a second, I considered ignoring it. Perhaps it was Michael with another justification, or Linda's number flashing to twist the knife further. But when I looked, it was Rachel. Her message was short. Dad, meet me tomorrow. I have to tell you something. I stared at the words. Tomorrow, a promise or a warning? I leaned back on the bench, closing my eyes to the cold sky. The skaters' laughter rose and fell, the sound almost mocking. How easily people float when they don't carry betrayal in their pockets. I slipped my hand into my coat, fingers brushing both the receipt and the order slip. Paper and ink. That's all my family had reduced me to, numbers and an erasure command. I whispered, half to myself, half to the night. Maybe rock bottom isn't the end. Maybe it's the foundation. Still, the question gnawed. Was Rachel's message a lifeline, or just another thread in a web I hadn't yet seen? The cafe in Queens was almost empty, its chipped wooden tables and humming espresso machine a stark contrast to the polished marble of Fifth Avenue. I arrived early, nursing a bitter black coffee that tasted more like punishment than comfort. The bell above the door jingled, and Rachel walked in, scarf wrapped tight, her eyes darting like she was being followed. She slid into the booth across from me, lowering her voice before I even spoke. They planned this weeks ago, Dad. The words hit harder than the coffee. I studied her face, searching for hesitation. There was none, only fear. Planned what? My tone was sharper than intended, but my patience had worn thin. Christmas. The dinner. All of it. She leaned closer, her whisper nearly drowned out by the hiss of steaming milk behind the counter. Mom and Michael didn't want you there. I gripped the edge of the table until my knuckles whitened. Why? Rachel hesitated, her lips trembling before she finally said it. Because you still hold the trust fund documents. The room seemed to tilt. A couple at the counter laughed over muffins, oblivious to the weight of what had just landed between us. Trust fund. Of course. The one I had set up 15 years ago for the grandchildren, tucked away under layers of legal language and signatures. A safety net for their future, not a bargaining chip in a family drama. Rachel, I said slowly, are you telling me they cut me out of my own family to get to money meant for you and Noah? Her silence was enough. She bit her lip, looking down at her hands, and I saw the truth there more than in her words. That night, back in my penthouse, I unlocked the safe behind the study bookshelf. My fingers knew the combination as if it were muscle memory, 1742-8. The door creaked open, the scent of metal and old paper spilling out. But the envelope, thick with legal documents and the weight of promises, was gone. Gone. I stared into the hollow space where my trust had once lived. A chill crawling up my spine. Was this the heart of it all? Not just betrayal of blood, but outright deceit woven into the very foundation I had built for them. I closed the safe, the sound echoing in the quiet room. My reflection in the glass door looked older, harsher, as if the truth had carved new lines overnight. And I whispered to no one, if this was a game, they should have known better than to leave me holding the pieces. The safe door still echoed in my mind as I carried the question like a stone in my chest. Who had the audacity to take what wasn't theirs? The answer revealed itself the next morning when I met Patrick O'Connor, my attorney of 20 years, in his Midtown office on Madison Avenue. Patrick was the kind of man who wore integrity the way others wore tailored suits, but today even his steady voice cracked. He laid the financial statements on the desk between us. Lines of numbers bled across the page, merciless and cold. "Thomas," he said, tapping his pen at the balance column, "your trust fund isn't intact. It shows withdrawals, steady ones, over the last 3 months, totaling $2.3 million. The air left my lungs. I stared at the figures, each digit slicing into me sharper than any blade. I remembered the day I set that trust up, January 4th, 2008, wiring the seed money, $5 million then, thinking it would safeguard my children and their children, not become a vault for betrayal. Patrick cleared his throat. "Some of these signatures on the authorization forms, they don't look right." He slid a copy forward. My name scrawled across the bottom of the page, except it wasn't mine. It was an impersonation, shaky in places but disturbingly close. My hands trembled. "Forgery." The word tasted metallic. Patrick nodded grimly. "This looks like forgery, yes. And whoever did this had access not only to your safe, but to internal banking codes. This isn't the work of an amateur." I pushed back from the desk, the leather chair groaning under the weight of my fury. My own son? Or someone pulling his strings? The question hung there, heavier than the Manhattan skyline pressing against the window. For a moment I hoped Patrick would deny it, laugh it off, reassure me. But he didn't. He leaned forward instead, voice low, deliberate. "Thomas, if Michael's involved, he isn't acting alone. Linda's name appears in too many places for coincidence, and if Samantha knew, then this web stretches farther than you want to believe." Silence settled between us, broken only by the muted buzz of traffic 10 stories below. I thought of Rachel's trembling voice in that cafe, of Noah's small hands clinging to my arm last Christmas. I thought of all the bricks I had laid to build this family, now being pried loose one by one. Was this still a home, or just a stage for a slow, cruel revenge story? Patrick finally stood, gathering the papers back into their folder. His gaze lingered on me, a rare softness beneath the lawyer's armor. "I'll investigate," quietly. "But Thomas, listen carefully. This could be bigger than you think." The words rang like a sentence, bigger than I thought, which meant darker than I dared imagine. The loft in Brooklyn smelled of fresh paint and ambition. Industrial brick walls, polished concrete floors, furniture that seemed more curated than lived in. It wasn't a home, it was a statement. I buzzed the intercom twice before Michael finally opened the door. He stood there in a dark sweater, arms folded, jaw set like stone. "Dad," he said flatly, "times change. You had your era." The words hit harder than I expected. My era. As if 66 years of sweat and sacrifice could be folded into a discarded newspaper and tossed aside. I stepped inside anyway, uninvited but unwilling to stay in the hallway like a stranger. "So you erase me with a receipt?" My voice carried, echoing against the loft's exposed beams. The folded bill of $12,384 still burned in my pocket like a brand. Before Michael could answer, Samantha appeared from the kitchen, glass of white wine in hand. She looked elegant, too polished, as if she had rehearsed this moment. "You're too sentimental, Thomas," she said, each word deliberate. "Business requires clean cuts." I stared at her, and for a flicker of a second I saw the sharp edge beneath her calm veneer. Clean cuts. How neatly she could dress betrayal in the language of efficiency. Michael shifted, avoiding my eyes, fiddling with the Rolex on his wrist. "It's not personal, Dad. You built something." Now it needs new management, that's all. I laughed then. Short, bitter. Not personal? When my own name is erased from my family's table? When forged signatures siphon off millions I built brick by brick? Tell me, Michael, where does business end and deceit begin? Silence. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator filled the space. Samantha sipped her wine, unbothered, as though we were discussing stock prices instead of a father's expulsion. Then, from the hallway, the soft scrape of sneakers. I turned. Noah stood frozen in the doorway, his small frame half hidden by the wall. His wide eyes betrayed what his ears had caught, a child overhearing the cracks in the empire built for him. For a moment, none of us moved. Time hung heavy. Then Noah's whisper broke it. "Grandpa?" The room stilled, every secret suddenly louder than the city roaring outside. If this story stayed with you for a moment, support us by liking and subscribing. Every click helps us tell the next one. The loft door shut behind me with a metallic click, but Noah had slipped out before Michael noticed. We met 2 blocks away, near a bodega that still smelled of fried plantains and cheap coffee. The boy tugged at my coat sleeve, his face pale under the flickering neon light. "Grandpa," he whispered, "why did Dad say you're finished?" I knelt down to his level. His eyes, those unguarded, honest eyes, searched mine as if I could rewrite the truth with a single answer. But what could I tell him? That power and pride had swallowed his father whole? That loyalty now had a price tag? Instead, I pulled him into an embrace, holding on longer than he probably understood. "Sometimes," I murmured, "people forget who built the ground they're standing on." My voice cracked in places I didn't expect. Noah leaned back, biting his lip the way Rachel used to when she was nervous before piano recitals. Then, almost as if remembering a secret too heavy for his small frame, he slipped a plain white envelope from his backpack. He glanced around, like a spy in training, before pressing it into my hand. "I found this in Dad's drawer," he said, barely audible. The envelope was warm from his pocket, edges slightly frayed, as if it had been hidden for weeks. I hesitated before tucking it inside my coat, the way a gambler hides a winning card too soon revealed. In that moment, I caught myself thinking, how cruel that a 10-year-old had to carry the burden of adult sins. Yet how fitting, in this twisted family drama, that truth would come from the youngest voice. I ruffled his hair, trying to disguise my trembling fingers. "Thank you, Noah. But promise me something. Whatever happens next, you stay out of it. This isn't your fight." He nodded, though the crease on his forehead told me he understood more than he should. As I watched him run back toward the glowing skyline of Brooklyn, the envelope weighed heavier than any check I had ever signed. Was this salvation, or the nail in my coffin? Back in the penthouse, the envelope lay on my desk like a dare. Central Park stretched beneath the glass wall, but its winter silence could not compete with the thundering in my chest. I slit it open with the edge of an old letter opener, the one Rachel gave me on my 60th birthday. What slid out was more devastating than any knife. A legal contract. My name signed neatly at the bottom, except it wasn't my hand. The pages were crisp, notarized. Official, transferring a bulk of my assets into Linda's control. 2 properties, the Reed Family Trust and the Manhattan penthouse itself. A neat siphoning of a lifetime. I called Patrick O'Connor and read the details over the phone. His voice hardened, all courtroom steel. "This is fraud, Thomas. Straightforward forgery. Whoever pulled this off had inside access." I stared at my own false signature. The loops too perfect, the ink too deliberate, like a mask that smiled while it strangled. Was it Michael? Or Linda herself? I could almost hear their laughter echoing off the marble floors of Fifth Avenue. For a moment I considered the absurdity of it, how decades of work could be erased by a few sheets of paper. And yet wasn't that the cruel genius of deceit? It never needed fire or fists, just ink and a willing hand. The phone buzzed again, but this time the number was unfamiliar. A hesitant voice answered when I picked up. "Mr. Reed, it's Isabella from the restaurant. I need to tell you something." I gripped the receiver tighter. "What is it?" She paused, and in the silence I could hear the faint clatter of dishes, the muffled hum of a service line. Then her whisper cut through. "I saw who gave the order that night. The one to strike your name off the list." The line trembled between us. My breath caught. "Who was it, Isabella? Tell me." Her answer didn't come. Only the sound of her breath, and then the line went dead. I stared at the receiver in my hand, 1,000 questions collapsing into one. What truth was she carrying, and how deep did this go? The call came late, long after Manhattan had gone quiet. Isabella's voice trembled through the receiver, but her words were sharp enough to split the night. "It wasn't Michael who gave the order, Mr. Reed. It was your ex-wife. Linda told the manager to strike you from the list." I froze. For weeks I had built Michael into the villain of this cruel stage play, the son who cast his father aside. Yet now the script was rewritten. "Are you certain?" My voice cracked against the stillness of the penthouse. "I saw it with my own eyes," Isabella insisted. She leaned across the counter, handed the paper, and said, "Remove Thomas Reed. Tonight is not for him." The line went silent. I pressed the phone tighter, as if pressure could squeeze a different answer from her lips. But truth, once spoken, does not retreat. I walked across the apartment, each step echoing off marble floors that suddenly felt more like an empty cathedral. My mind spun. Michael's clipped tones, his cold dismissal. Had they been his words at all, or Linda's chiseled into his mouth? I remembered a Christmas long ago when Michael was 12. Linda had whispered to him then too, telling him what gift to hand me, what words to say. My son had always been her echo. Had I mistaken her shadow for his betrayal all along? I whispered into the void, so Michael wasn't the mastermind? The city outside glittered, blind to my unraveling. A father, discarded. A son, manipulated. And Linda, the woman who once shared my vows, holding the strings like a quiet puppeteer. The cruelty of it almost made me laugh. My whole life I thought the danger lay in business rivals, hostile takeovers, lawyers with sharp pens. I never imagined the fiercest contest would be fought in my own living room, scripted by the woman I once trusted most. And yet, was Michael only a pawn? Or had he willingly traded conscience for comfort, letting his mother write him into her play? The thought clung to me like the winter fog curling through Central Park. Perhaps the deeper betrayal was not in the strike of a pen, but in a son's silence while it happened. The night ended with one certainty. The stage of this family drama was darker and more twisted than I ever guessed. And the real author of my erasure had been sitting quietly in the wings all along. The courtroom in Lower Manhattan smelled faintly of polished wood and nerves. The ceiling loomed high above, its arches reminding me more of a cathedral than a chamber of law, as if justice itself required divine blessing to survive in this city. Patrick stood at the center, a stack of documents in his hands. His voice carried with the steadiness of a man who knew his evidence could not be ignored. "Your Honor, these signatures are not Mr. Reed's. The ink trails, the slant, the timestamp on the filing, all of it points to a calculated forgery." Across the aisle, Linda sat composed, her hands folded as if she were attending a Sunday recital. Her lawyer rose, lips curled in a smile too sharp for civility. "Your Honor, what we have here is nothing more than the bitter ramblings of a man who cannot accept change. He's seeking attention, not truth." The words struck harder than they should have, because they were dressed in a tone so casual, so dismissive, it almost convinced the room. I clenched my fists beneath the polished oak table. I rose slowly, each creak of my knees sounding like an announcement of my years. "Attention?" My voice caught the hush of the court. "I am not asking for applause. I am asking why my own blood found it necessary to erase me, to reduce me to a line item on a balance sheet." For a flicker of a second, Michael's eyes shifted downward. Linda, though, remained steady, her expression unreadable, the mask of a woman who had rehearsed this moment. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Reed, stay to the facts." I nodded, though inside my chest facts and feelings had long ago blurred into one. This was not just about numbers. It was about nights spent reading bedtime stories, college tuition checks signed without hesitation, hospital bills quietly paid. And here I stood, accused of clinging, when all I wanted was acknowledgement that my life's bricks had not been mortared in vain. Then, just as Patrick prepared to lay out the final proof, the back door creaked open. A small figure slipped inside, hesitant but determined. Noah, his backpack still slung over one shoulder, his hair messy from the rush. He raised his voice before anyone could silence him. "Grandpa is telling the truth." The room froze. Gasps rippled. Judges hate surprises, but sometimes truth does not wait for permission. My heart, which had felt carved into stone, suddenly beat with a pulse of fragile hope. Out of the mouths of children comes the clarity adults bury under strategy and lies. For a brief moment, I wondered, could this boy's honesty topple the tower of deceit his elders had built brick by brick? Or would the court swallow him whole, dismissing him as just another pawn in this sprawling family drama? The gavel struck once, calling for order, but inside me, order had already collapsed, giving way to a fire I had not felt in years. If this journey stirred your heart, leave a like and subscribe. It's the fuel that lets us keep creating more. The courtroom still buzzed with Noah's words when the judge called a recess. It was as though the building itself exhaled, releasing the tension that had knotted every wooden beam. Yet the air did not clear. It thickened, because everyone knew the next hour would decide whether the lies unraveled or held. When we returned, Patrick laid the final document flat on the table. The forged contract transferring my properties to Linda. He tapped the signature line, his finger steady. "This is not Mr. Reed's hand. We brought in 2 forensic experts. Both confirm forgery." The judge's brow furrowed. Eyes turned toward Linda. For the first time, the mask cracked. Her lips tightened, her posture rigid, as if bracing for a storm. Then Michael stood. His voice was louder than I had ever heard, raw with betrayal. "Mom, you used me?" The silence that followed was a canyon. Linda's hands trembled just slightly, then steadied as she placed them on the table. "Everything I did," she said, her tone carrying the heavy weight of conviction, "was for this family, to protect us, to make sure we survived, thrived, controlled what we built. It might have sounded noble to strangers, but to those of us who knew, the words reeked of self-preservation. This wasn't protection. It was conquest dressed as sacrifice, a twisted hymn in the language of revenge stories, sung to justify every wound she inflicted." Michael's face broke, boy and man at once. "No!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the paneled walls. "You didn't do it for us! You did it for yourself!" The words tore something invisible in the room, a fracture that could not be mended. Even the judge paused, as if reluctant to interrupt the raw collapse of a family in plain view. I watched my son, the child I once carried on my shoulders, now standing alone, stripped of illusion. And I watched Linda, who had orchestrated the stage with such precision, suddenly falter under the simplest of truths. The gavel struck. "Order!" the judge commanded, though no one truly heard him. Because the echo of Michael's cry still lingered, a wound laid bare for all to see. And I thought, perhaps justice is not only a verdict. Sometimes it is the moment when masks fall away, leaving nothing but the naked face of ambition. The courtroom quieted after Michael's outburst. You could hear the shuffle of papers, the creak of benches, the nervous cough of someone in the back row. Michael turned toward me, his face streaked with tears, no longer the man who once spoke with arrogance, but the boy I used to tuck in at night. His voice cracked. "Dad, I'm sorry. I thought I was protecting her, protecting us. I didn't see what she was doing. I didn't want to see." For a long moment I said nothing. Silence was its own language here, a pause heavy with decades of love and disappointment. My chest felt tight, not from anger anymore, but from something more complicated. Grief for the son I lost to ambition, and hope for the man who might still rise from its ashes. Finally, I spoke softly. "You broke me, Michael. But maybe you can heal yourself." The words hung between us, neither absolution nor condemnation. A bridge, fragile, trembling, waiting to see if he would step across. His shoulders collapsed, as if the weight he carried had finally slipped free. He nodded, unable to answer. And in that nod, there was a small surrender, an opening that years of silence had refused to give. Across the aisle, Linda sat rigid, her lawyer whispering frantically in her ear. She ignored him, staring straight ahead, her jaw clenched, her eyes betraying something she would never admit: fear. The walls she built with layers of manipulation, the fortress of deceit, were crumbling in front of her own children. The judge re-entered, gavel in hand. The room braced. "After reviewing the evidence," he said, voice sharp and steady, "this court finds Linda Reed guilty of fraud and forgery. All transfers of assets are hereby nullified. Furthermore, Mrs. Reed is stripped of her rights to the Reed family inheritance." Gasps rippled through the room. The words cut cleaner than any knife. A dynasty she tried to control had slipped through her hands in a single declaration. Linda's eyes darted toward Michael, perhaps expecting him to defend her. He did not. He lowered his gaze, ashamed yet resolute. The ties had snapped, and no plea could mend them. I sat still, my heart unsteady, my mind asking questions I could not voice. How many years had been stolen by ambition disguised as love? How much of a family can be rebuilt when the foundation has cracked so deep? The gavel struck again. "Court adjourned!" But for us, the trial was not over. The real verdict would be decided at home, around tables, in words spoken and unspoken. And I wondered, as Michael wiped his eyes and avoided my stare, was this the beginning of repair, or only another scar on a long chain of wounds? The papers came through faster than expected. A courier from the Manhattan courthouse handed me the official ruling at noon on a gray Wednesday, his pen still smelling of ink. The trust was restored, the forged signatures voided, the trap dismantled. On paper, I was freeing, yet freedom rarely looks the way you imagine. Numbers on a page can be corrected, but the fractures of trust don't get notarized back into place. Michael stood across the room, his suit wrinkled as though he hadn't slept. He wasn't the son who strutted into boardrooms. He looked more like a man who'd been stripped of armor. "Dad," he said carefully, "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to earn something back, even if it takes years." His voice cracked, and for once, he didn't try to hide it. I studied him. 1,000 images clashed in my mind. The boy who once built Lego towers in the living room, the young man who argued about tuition bills, the adult who signed away my name with cold precision. Could those pieces coexist? Or were they shards too sharp to hold? Rachel broke the silence. She moved to my side, slipped her hand into mine, and said what none of us dared to. "We're still a family, Dad." The words sounded simple, almost naive. But in that moment, they carried more weight than the $2.3 million trust fund that had nearly destroyed us. Outside, Central Park stretched wide, trees bending under the autumn wind. Joggers passed, tourists snapped photos, children chased pigeons that refused to be caught. I pressed my palm to the glass, watching, wondering. The city was alive, pulsing with stories, each person carrying their own broken narrative. I whispered, not sure if anyone heard me. But what does family mean now? Was it loyalty? Was it survival? Was it forgiveness that didn't erase the wound but allowed the bleeding to stop? The answer didn't come. Only the wind against the window and the uneasy quiet of 3 people who once shared everything, now trying to decide what could still be shared. Snow drifted past the tall windows of the penthouse, muffling the chaos of New York below. 1 year had passed. Yet the echoes of that night still lingered. The long table was smaller now, no grand chandeliers, no orchestra playing too loudly, no hollow toasts that rang false. Just Rachel, Noah, Michael, and a few friends who had proven themselves loyal when the storm broke. Thomas moved slowly, his hands older, steadier, holding meaning in every gesture. He placed the framed receipt, $12,384.50, still crisp, still damning, at the center of the table. Not as a trophy, but as a caution. A reminder that betrayal does not disappear with time. It only teaches you how fragile even blood can be. Michael sat at the edge, shoulders hunched, speaking little. His silence was not emptiness, but work in progress, a man trying to rebuild without knowing if the foundation would hold. Rachel filled the air with warmth, guiding Noah to hang ornaments, her laughter genuine, but tinged with memory. Noah, innocent still, asked no questions, though his eyes carried more wisdom than most adults. Outside, the city glowed with light, but inside, the glow was gentler. No battles tonight, no courtroom fights, no paper trails of deceit. Only the quiet pulse of something broken learning to heal. Thomas lifted his glass. "The most expensive dinners," he said softly, "are not paid in dollars, but in broken trust." His eyes traveled around the table, resting on each face as if weighing the cost again. Then, after a pause that seemed to stretch across generations, he asked the question that had haunted him since that night. "Tell me, what would you have done if it were your family?" No answer came, but the silence was not empty. It was the silence of snow falling, of wounds closing, of a house slowly remembering how to be a home. Because in the end, even the darkest family drama leaves behind a choice, to let bitterness reign or to light one candle against the dark. And sometimes, one candle is enough. A year had passed, but the story was not over. Life rarely gives us neat endings. It gives us doors cracked open, a knock at midnight, an unexpected message waiting on the phone. Healing, after all, is not the closing of a book. It's the slow writing of a new chapter. The framed receipt gleamed under the Christmas lights, both relic and lesson, a symbol of loss, but also of survival. And outside, the city kept moving, just as they would. Final reflection. We are all asked, sooner or later, to decide what family truly means. Perhaps it is not perfection. Perhaps it is the courage to stay, even when staying hurts.